We are back together again, Dad.
Wow.
Back together again. We're like the Brady Bunch. Back together again. You might have seen him on Zoom before, but now we're together in the flesh. Live. Coming to you live from the nation's capital. Say what's up to the people, Dad.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's nice to have everybody.
It is.
I want to say hello to Patrick Murray, Ryan on Wheels, Karen Strickler, Elemental Bot, Barry Smith, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Hubert, Jamie Smith, Jim, Bill. Wow, there's a lot of people out there today.
We have any presidents out there?
And no presidents have shown up in the chat yet.
No,
but
they'll be there.
Captain M90s is here.
We got our
BT
captains
is here. Yes, we got the captains here. How do you want to start us off today, Dad?
Yeah, I do want to talk about the horrific gun massacre in Maine. And of course, our hearts go out to the families and friends of all the victims and those who are still in danger in Maine. But I have to say this, for decades, our shameful leaders who are captives of the corrupt NRA have given nothing more than thoughts and prayers to these mass killings, completely ignoring the need for reasonable gun control that the American people overwhelmingly support. We have more mass killings in America than all of our peer nations in Europe, Australia, and Canada combined. Looking at our closest peer nations, the G7 and Australia, an American per capita is 20 times more likely to be murdered by a gun than a resident of those other countries. Not 20%, but 20 times more likely. I warned about this in my 2020 book, Repeal the Second Amendment, The Case for a Safer America. But our politicians, who are subservient to the NRA have simply, hidden their eyes, stopped up their ears to what needs to be done to deal with the horrific epidemic of gun violence, which is now the biggest killer of children in this country. It is just an extraordinary menace, and we know how to deal with it because we have the models of these other nations. These other nations also have problems with mental health and gangs and addiction, but the big difference that makes this 20-fold difference is reasonable gun controls. As I point out in my book, the Supreme Court in 2010, in a 5-4 decision led by the late conservative Justice Antonin Scalia, completely distorted the Second Amendment to establish for the first time in over 200 years that the Second Amendment gives an individual right to keep and bear arms. If that was the case, why in the world would they include to establish a well-regulated militia? If it was just an individual right to bear arms, you wouldn't need to talk about the militia because that would already be covered. Samuel, who drafted the Second Amendment? Who wrote it? What great American statesman, do you know?
I have no idea.
James Madison.
Okay.
And what did James Madison hold in Virginia? Slaves. Think about this. James Madison wrote the Second Amendment a slaveholder. Slaveholders voted for the Second Amendment in Congress. They voted to ratify it in the states. Do you think for one moment all of these slaveholders would have voted for the Second Amendment and voted to ratify it if they believed for a second that it authorized an individual right to keep and bear arms that would include, of course, all black people in America and, by the way, all women? But by tying it to a well-regulated militia, you stop that because blacks and women at the time were not allowed in the militia. It's just sad how our history and legacy has been distorted to prevent real gun safety in America. But there's more to talk about, isn't there, Sam?
Well, I have a couple questions on that first.
Yes.
Mark Klein brings up an interesting point, which he says he knows you have your book advocating for repealing the Second Amendment, and he says, I can't get jiggy with that. There's going to be so much backlash to your stance. Isn't there a better way to go about this than taking away the Second Amendment?
There really isn't, because as long as the Second Amendment exists, as we've seen from these Supreme Court decisions and lower court decisions, any reasonable gun control that is passed becomes in jeopardy of being struck down by the courts. We have no protection to really adopt reasonable gun control measures. The other point I want to make is, of course, I understand how difficult it would be to repeal a constitutional amendment. Although it was done, do you know what constitutional amendment was repealed?
No.
The Prohibition Amendment,
okay.
Within a dozen years was repealed.
But don't you think you could make the argument about slaves and women for the entire Constitution? I mean, the entire Constitution was written before slaves and women.
But this is unique. This gives slaves and women guns. It's the only provision that does that. Even leaving aside women, do you think slaveholders for a moment would have supported an amendment that put guns in the hands of black people? Of course not.
No, but they probably would have written some loophole.
They did. They tied it to a well-regulated militia that barred black people from service in the militia. Black people did not begin to serve in the militia until the Civil War era, 80 years or so, 70 some odd years later. So absolutely, they barred blacks from keeping and bearing arms by tying it to a well-regulated militia. And by the way, Justice Scalia, who wrote the decision in 2010 for the first time, establishing that the Second Amendment gives an individual right to keep and bear arms, he could not cite, even though he's an originalist who supposedly believes in the intention of the framers, he could not cite a single individual involved in framing, adopting, or ratifying the Second Amendment who said it protected an individual right to keep and bear arms. Not one of the thousands of persons involved in this process said such a thing.
Here's an interesting question from Ryan on Wheels. They say the Second Amendment says well-regulated militia. Did the framers not envision the U.S. having a standing army?
That's a great question. And the framers were very, very suspicious of establishing a standing army because that could become a means of snuffing out the rights and liberties that they shed blood for in the American Revolution, and that they therefore believed that the primary military establishment in this country would be the citizen militia who could bear arms as established under the Second Amendment. And if you look at the debates in Congress as well, the debates were all about, could people, say Quakers, who are against military service, could they opt out of the well-regulated militia? There were no debates about an individual right to keep and bear arms.
Ross Goldberg asks, yeah, but even if we outlawed guns, wouldn't there still be millions of Americans who still found ways to buy guns illegally?
Of course there would. But as the experience of all other democratic nations show, when you have reasonable gun control, you vastly cut down on the amount of violence. Yes, hardened criminals who really wanted to get guns probably could get guns. But as I point out in my book, most gun murders are not committed by hardened criminals, including all of these mass shootings. Virtually no mass shooter, including, I believe, this Mr. Cord in Maine.
Don't say his name.
Yeah, well, okay.
That's
why I just put his last name, although it's all over the media.
Wow.
I'm not disclosing anything. None of them had criminal records. And for non-mass shootings, most mass shootings are people who know one another. We have this vision in America as most murders, hardened criminals bursting into your home with guns blazing. That is very, very unusual. Most murders result from arguments or grudges among people who know one another.
What do you say to... I keep putting the wrong thing on. What do you say to Republicans that say all of these cities in America with these really stringent gun laws are also the highest gun violence cities?
Not true. If you look at gun laws are not primarily city, they're primarily state. And I did a study of this in my 2020 book, and I compared states like Connecticut and Pennsylvania and California that have the strictest gun laws with states like Wyoming and Missouri, which have the loosest gun laws, and states with the strictest gun laws, gun murders are a small fraction of that with the states with the loosest gun laws. The other problem is you need national gun laws because guns go across state lines. I also did a study in my book showing that as compared to states with loose gun laws, states with strict gun laws, a substantial proportion of the guns confiscated in crimes came across the border from states with loose gun laws.
All right. I guess we got into a little bit of a Second Amendment debate. That's
It's
fine.
a great debate.
Yeah.
And let me say this.
Yeah.
I fully understand the chances of passing a Second Amendment, repealing a Second Amendment are very slim. It's so hard to get a constitutional amendment. But we need to change the game. You know, to this point, the gun control advocates have been saying, we support the Second Amendment, but that is a weak argument that plays right into the hands of the NRA and the gun lobby. And by the way, the NRA is pretty much an offshoot of the gun manufacturers and the gun sellers in America. It's where they get a lot of their money. That plays right into their hands. Even if the goal may not be easily achievable, it would still shake up the whole debate about guns in America.
Paul Folo wants to know, Lichtman, how much did piracy, Indian raids, and English imprisonment have to do with the Second Amendment?
Probably not all that much. That was more of an issue that came later. That was a spark plug for the War of 1812. What had to do with the passage of the Second Amendment were internal revolts that occurred in the United States prior to the adoption of the Constitution and were an impetus for nationalists like Washington and Madison to scrap the Articles of Confederation and adopt the stronger government of the Constitution and establish a basis for a militia that primarily was used to control internal rebellions. This notion that the Second Amendment armed citizens so that they could, rise up, so that they could, establish their liberties against the tyrannical government. In fact, just the opposite is true. The Second Amendment and the establishment of militia was used to quell internal insurrections, which was then strengthened a little bit later by the Insurrection Act.
Jordan Marchev wants to know, would universal background checks help?
Yes, universal background checks that were real and extended to gun shows and not just licensed gun dealers would help. But the single most important reform that reduces gun violence most significantly is permit laws like they've had in New York State and that now are under fire. But basically, as I point out in my book, we need a sort of a whole host of gun control laws, real background checks, permit laws, prohibitions on assault weapons, which have no essential use other than to efficiently kill and maim people, and controls over high-capacity magazines, and controls over ghost guns and gun storage.
Michael D'Souza Cruz says, but the Second Amendment says infringe, which means violate the law, and not abridge, limit, which means the bearing of arms can be limited. Yes? Question mark.
The banning of arms absolutely can be.
But I'm saying, does saying infringe, people say that as an absolute?
No.
No.
Of course not. There's no even the right of free speech is not absolute, as Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great justice, points out. It doesn't give you leave to shout fire in a crowded theater, doesn't give you leave to order murders, or apropos of what's going on in the Donald Trump trial today, it doesn't give you leave to directly or indirectly have your subordinates falsify business records.
What would you say to somebody who said to you, the government is armed to the T, why shouldn't the citizens have guns too?
Because, as I said, the purpose of the Second Amendment was, in fact, to arm the government to put down rebellions. And, of course, the truth is, however you arm the citizens, it's not going to be an equal or even remotely equal fight with the government. But that was never the purpose of the Second Amendment and has never really been a significant element in this country. What guns have been used for is killing our fellow Americans. I remind you, gun violence is the single highest cause of death among young people in this country. We have more mass killings than all of our peer nations combined by multiples, not just a small amount. And when you have a mass killing, like we saw in Maine, it doesn't just affect the victims, their families, and their friends. It has a ripple effect across the entire society where people just don't feel safe anymore. And we're never going to feel safe so long as we have this expansive interpretation of the Second Amendment and loose gun controls that mark us as an anomaly among democratic peer nations.
Yeah, and I think people forget that the U.S. government is armed with a lot more weaponry than a single citizen can ever own.
Yes, tanks,
So
machine guns, missiles,
this wet
planes.
dream of defending yourself from the government, I don't think you would last very long.
No.
Even with a huge army behind you, I don't think.
No, it's not going to happen, and that was never the purpose of the Second Amendment. And, of course, as I said, we stand out as an anomaly. I repeat, you are 20 times more likely to be killed by a gun in America than in our closest peer nations.
But what hope is there for gun violence reform? Because, like you said, repealing the Second Amendment isn't very likely. The Senate and the House, either they go back and forth on bills or they're so divided they can't get a bill done.
There's only one way, and that's to vote out Republicans who overwhelmingly are the ones standing in the way of gun control. You got to have change in the legislature. You're not going to persuade them to suddenly become fervent advocates of gun control.
All right, let's move on. I think that was a good debate.
It was a great debate.
Let's talk about what's happening in these Trump trials, Dad. Mark Meadows has received immunity, and 3 of Trump's co-defendants have pled guilty in Georgia. Go.
Of enormous significance. Let's separate this out. First, let's look at the 3 lawyers who flipped in the Georgia RICO case: Powell, Chesebro, and Ellis. One of Donald Trump's, and maybe his only defense, has been, I did not intend to commit crimes. I was simply following good advice from my lawyers. Well, the lawyers have now said we weren't giving him good advice. We were, in fact, part of a criminal conspiracy, and we are pleading guilty to that criminal conspiracy. And as part of our plea agreement, we have agreed to testify truthfully, which means we can't, what they said in the plea agreement, that they were part of this criminal conspiracy, or if they do that, their plea agreement can be voided and they could be subject to 5 to 20 years in prison. I don't think any of these lawyers want to go into one of the notorious prisons in Georgia. So I think they're going that plea agreement's going to hold, and they're going to testify truthfully that yes, we were part of a criminal conspiracy. We were not giving Donald Trump legitimate legal advice. And let's remember, all of those who were officially part of the Trump administration, the Attorney General, the head of cybersecurity, his own White House counsel, were all telling him that you lost the election. There's no stolen election here. The election was fair and secure. So even before these folks flipped, that defense was very, very weak. Now it has, I believe, totally collapsed. And then, of course, these three lawyers could also testify in the Department of Justice January 6th case. And again, they can't say one thing in Georgia and another thing in D.C., that they have to be consistent in their testimony, or they could be, prosecuted for perjury. So these flips go beyond Georgia. In addition, I understand that according to press reports, I don't have any inside information, DA Fani Willis in Georgia is engaged in discussions about plea bargaining with other of those indicted, of the 19 persons indicted. She was roundly criticized by the pundits. Oh, you indicted too many, you're overreaching, it's too big a case. But now she looks really shrewd and smart because she is getting all of these flips, from among the 19 that she had indicted. Now Mark Meadows, again, according to press reports, I have no inside information, has been given immunity by the special counsel in the January 6th case in D.C. that's scheduled for trial in early March. And Meadows apparently, according to press reports again, has already testified several times before the officers of the special counsel. This is critical because Mark Meadows was Trump's chief of staff during this whole process of trying to overturn the 2020 election. He has the inside story, and his testimony could be extremely damning to Donald Trump. And how do we know that beyond what I've just said? Donald Trump's attacked him, attacked the whole process of, giving Mark Meadows immunity. Pretty soon he'll be saying, Meadows who? I don't really know the guy. Maybe he brought me coffee one time.
That's a good one, Dad.
Thanks.
We have a super chat from...
Awesome. We need it.
From that's their name.
That's great.
They say, one of my friends is planning to vote in the Republican primary and vote for Ron DeSantis to try and stop Trump because they think it will most likely come to those two choices. He believes DeSantis is a lesser evil than Trump. What are your thoughts, Dad?
Oh, God.
I don't think that'll work either. I don't think it'll work. People have thought about that strategy many times in the past. It's not a good strategy, I don't think, to try to join the Republican or Democratic primary to vote for the person who you don't want to win the primary.
Yeah, we're talking about the frying pan and the fire. I'm not sure DeSantis is much better than Donald Trump. Look at all the authoritarian moves he's making in Florida, including something that is dear and near to my heart, imposing a conservative orthodoxy on education, basically telling people like me, who are experts in our field, history and social studies and political science, what we should teach, and in so doing, completely distorting the historical record and the contemporary status of race relations in America. Having us teach things like slaves, develop useful skills. Yeah, how useful could it be when you can't start a business, you can't have a bank account, you can't provide for your kids, you can't move, you can't stop from being whipped or confined, you can't stop your family from being broken up. Plus, out of millions of slaves, they cited 16 examples. I went through every one of them. 14 out of the 16 were completely wrong, including they had George Washington's white sister as a slave. They had another person who was born in 1885, 20 years after slavery, as a slave. This is what they're trying to make us teach. Pure fiction made up in order to support their advocacy. So I'm not sure DeSantis is a whole lot better than Trump. He may personally not be quite as offensive as Trump, but in terms of what he might do as president, he could be just as dangerous.
Miles Wolf wants to know, why are Republicans going after Jennifer Granholm? Do you know who that is?
Yes, Jennifer Granholm, she's Secretary of Energy, and I guess they're going after her, because they want complete license to drill, dig, extract, burn fossil fuels, and total disregard of catastrophic climate change, which is not a theory anymore. It's here. It's evident in the storms, the fires, the tornadoes, the droughts, the melting glaciers, the rising sea levels. And virtually every scientist who's looked at this concludes that catastrophic climate change poses an existential threat to our planet. And by the way, this new speaker, Mike Johnson, is a fervent climate change denier and a fervent advocate of burning fossil fuels.
We'll get to him later.
Yeah, but this relates to Jennifer Granholm.
Do you think Trump is able to flip states in 2024? You don't answer that, right? Because
we don't know yet.
Well, didn't you say once you don't answer that because that's part of your prediction or something like that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I have not made a prediction yet. But as you know, I give no credence to early polls. The early polls had Jimmy Carter 30 points ahead of Ronald Reagan, wound up losing by 10 points. But, the conventional wisdom says, if the polls show Trump and Biden closely tied for the national vote, that's going to give Trump a big advantage because he'll have an advantage in the swing states. Well, it's crazy about this polling, which is not predictive, but kind of refutes that argument, is while Trump and Biden are tied in the national vote, in a lot of the state polls in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, Biden is actually ahead. So this, again, the pundits are just wrong. They're just talking off the top of their heads.
3 rapid fire questions, Dad. Do you think Ukraine aid will continue? Do you think Trump trials will...
Well, let's take it one at a time.
Do you think Ukraine aid will continue?
Yes, I do think Ukraine aid will continue.
Do you think that Trump trials will happen before the election?
At least some of them.
Do you still have the same expectation that no labels won't turn a third-party key?
I don't think no labels will. I'm looking more hard at Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
You think Trump has a chance in Pennsylvania?
Sure.
Okay, there you go.
I'm not predicting he's going to win Pennsylvania, but yeah, you can't rule it out at this, but it's too early to rule anything in or out.
John Jones asks, hi, Allan. If House Republicans impeach Biden, would that automatically flip the scandal key? We've talked about that.
Yeah, absolutely not.
No,
First of
not
all, it's not going to happen.
Right.
They can't even get their act together to barely elect a speaker.
Right.
They're not going to impeach Biden.
Let's talk a little bit about Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, who was just voted in. Go for it.
Yeah. Here's the critical point. There are no moderate Republicans left.
That's what I said when you were saying last episode, they're going to elect some moderate Republican. I said, who?
You were right, and I was wrong on that. That doesn't seem to be any, maybe more moderate than the extremists like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz. But all the Republicans united behind Mike Johnson, who is as extremist as Jim Jordan. He's not loud like Jim Jordan. He's more soft-spoken, but that's irrelevant. Other than that, he is no different than Jim Jordan. Maybe in some respects, even more dangerous to our democracy because he's shrewder, he's smarter. He was one of the architects, not just a supporter, but an architect of the efforts to overturn our democracy and steal the 2020 election. He is a fervent anti-abortion advocate. He is against rights for people who don't look like him and don't share his sexual preferences. And he is a fervent climate change denier and an advocate for burning fossil fuels. Our good friend Jamie Raskin, our congressperson here, was on TV the other day, and he summed it up and he said, you can't get further right than Mike Johnson. He is as far right as it's possible to be.
How do you think that's going to affect the election or the Republicans' chances in the House? You think he's just too quiet to really make any difference?
Yeah, I think the Republicans were smart to have a quiet right-winger, say that fast 3 times.
Right-winger, right-winger, right-winger. I did.
Very good. You get the prize.
What I get?
Handshake. So they were very smart to elect a quiet extremist rather than a raucous extremist like Jim Jordan. But I do think the utter chaos of Republicans in the House, people aren't following that closely, but they have some idea that Republicans haven't gotten their act together. The approval of Congress in one poll came out today was 11%, an all-time low record for the approval of Congress. And the only thing that fundamentally changed was the Republican chaos in the House. I don't think it'll affect my prediction for presidential elections, but it certainly in swing districts could mitigate against Republicans.
Do you think the fiasco that was the speakership election will affect them in any way? Or you think most people will totally forget that by the time the election rolls around?
People might forget it, but it was so blatant that, and Democrats are already crafting ads based upon what Republicans are doing.
Right, but we're still so far away.
Yeah.
I mean, who's going to... I mean, obviously, like, big political heads will remember this, but I feel like the majority of Americans won't go into the polls
I agree.
thinking about this.
You're absolutely right, but you don't need the majority of Americans.
What do you need, then?
A few voters in the swing districts.
Does low growth, like plus 0.3, equals bad short-term economy? Is that true?
No.
No.
It has to be a recession. And by the way, we just got the third quarter growth results today, and it was astonishing. 4.9%, one of the most robust numbers that we've seen in decades. It's just was a huge surprise. I'm not saying that'll be sustained, but it certainly can be very hard now, unless the economy hits a recession, for the Democrats to lose the long-term economic key. This creates an interesting situation with respect to the shutdown of the government. On the one hand, it's not in the Republicans' interest to shut down the government. They'll get blamed for it, and it'll hurt congressional campaigns. On the other hand, if you shut down the government and it plunges the economy into recession, that's going to hurt Joe Biden's re-election chances. So Republicans in the House, have to weigh these two political imperatives. And I think in the end, they're going to consider their own election more important than the presidential election.
Staffer wants to know, how afraid are you when the Voting Rights Act comes up for reauthorization with Republicans like this?
I'm very much afraid if Republicans continue to hold the House that they would not vote for reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act. Most Republicans don't believe anymore. They once did. The Voting Rights Act, it was conservative back then, Southern Democrats who were against it, not Republicans, but it's a different Republican Party.
Here's an interesting question from the Smoking Cat.
Whoa.
The stock market is tanking. Will that continue, and what effect does that have on the economy and the election?
Hey, if I knew where the stock market was going, I'd be an awful lot richer.
That's a good point.
So I'm not going to predict the stock market.
But you have to think that these conflicts around the world are not going to be good for the stock market, right? Or no?
Probably not, but who knows? The stock market is very, very tricky. As I said, we'd have a lot more rich people, including you, if we could predict the stock market.
Yeah, if I could predict the stock market, I wouldn't be doing this show with you, I'll tell you that much.
Why not?
Because I'd be rich.
So rich it wouldn't matter.
I wouldn't have to do this show.
You wouldn't have to get, what do they call these donations?
Super chats.
So you wouldn't have to get super chats.
There's a lot of people asking about recession. I think we've talked about this quite a bit, though, right?
We have.
There's no sign of recession right now.
No sign of recession.
It's hard to predict recessions.
Very impossible to predict. But obviously, if there's a long-term government shutdown, that would make a recession more likely. It wouldn't guarantee a recession, but it would certainly make a recession more likely.
What's your sense of how the U.S. Senate race will shake out in Arizona with Republican Kari Lake, Independent Kristen Sinema, and Democrat Ruben Gallego?
Kari Lake, of course, is a woman clone of Donald Trump, one of the most fervent election deniers we have. It would be a tragedy if Kristen Sinema, who I don't understand what she's doing, would throw a monkey wrench into that race. Gallego versus Lake, straight up, I think the Democrat wins. In a three-way race, who knows?
Why isn't there a Senate majority key?
Because only 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years, whereas
Right.
the whole House is elected.
Right, that's a good point. Lichtman, how do you feel about New York Dems? I'm not sure how to say this guy's name. Howell and Adams. Hochul and Adams questioning open borders. Do you have any thoughts about that? Probably not, right?
No, and this open borders thing is just not true. There aren't open borders. It is very, very difficult, though, to deal with the flow of migrants. But the administration just recently seems to have succeeded in substantially cutting down the flow of migrants and more effectively dealing with those who come into the United States.
Here's an interesting question. How do you see Ukraine aid passing the House now that Mike Johnson is Speaker and he actively doesn't support Ukraine aid? And it seems like a lot of Republicans actively don't support Ukraine aid.
You need 5 Republicans.
So, I mean, we asked you earlier, is it going to pass? You said yes. But
I think it will pass because I think there are enough, it may not be a majority of Republicans by any means, but I think there are enough Republicans who support Ukraine. It is beyond my comprehension, although I kind of do understand it, why Republicans have softened on Ukraine aid and seem to be inclined not to challenge Putin. Republicans used to be the champions of opposition to totalitarianism in the old Soviet Union. And now, as Republicans have taken an authoritarian turn, they seem to be sympathetic to murderous dictators like Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Donald Trump says, we have love letters. Love letters from a murderer, guy who uses anti-aircraft guns to kill his political opposition. And they also seem to be cozying up to Putin. It is a tragedy beyond dimension. We've seen this movie before. We had the America First movement in 1940 and 1941 that said we shouldn't do anything to resist Hitler, not even aid Britain or France. Just let Hitler take over and there would be no problem. Can you imagine if Hitler had taken over all of Europe? The United States would have been under the gravest of jeopardy, especially, the Jewish people in America.
I totally agree. I do have a question, though. Where's the balancing act between the kind of hyper-militarization across the world that America does and picking the right places to put their thumb on the scale?
Yeah, I'm not a big supporter of, militarization. But when the place to put your thumb on the scale is when you see the genocidal activities of murderous dictators like he's committing genocide. And, the UN folks who study these things all understand that.
Who's he?
Putin.
Right.
Committed genocide.
But a lot of people are
Ukraine.
also saying that the Israeli government is committing genocide against the Palestinians.
Well, that is a problem. I've talked about this a lot, and I'm always quoting Eisenhower from 70 plus years ago. There is no military solution to the Palestinians versus the Israelis. Both sides, unfortunately, have committed atrocities. And God knows how, there is ever going to be a peaceful diplomatic solution. I have for a long time been an advocate of the two-state solution, which I think is the only answer. But, can the Palestinians and the Israelis live in close proximity to one another? That's a serious open question.
Well, I guess I asked that question because you said, when there's these clear-cut things, but often the world isn't that clear-cut. This idea between Palestine and Israel
is not clear-cut.
It's not clear-cut. So, again, where is the line? I mean, Ukraine is about as clear-cut case as we've had in forever. Since
Ukraine
World War II,
is clear-cut.
But a lot of people don't think so at the same time. We think it's clear-cut, but a lot of Americans don't think it's clear-cut.
Well, because I don't think they understand what's going on. And just like a lot of Americans were part of this horrific America First movement in 1940 and 1941 that would have ceded the world to Hitler and let him exterminate, as many Jews as he possibly could find. So, yeah, it's not like it's obvious, but I do think there is a difference between Ukraine and what's going on in Israel and Palestine.
The following demographics seem to have teeth in 24: Gen Z, women, and former Republican voters. How many of these do you think will contribute to a Biden 24 victory, and do you think Democrats can activate this vote?
Well, as you know, I don't predict elections based on a breakdown of voter groups. That's not an effective way of predicting elections because, as your question shrewdly indicates, you never know how these groups are going to be activated prior to an election. That's why I look at the bigger picture of these critical 13 integral parameters that turn elections.
Sean P. asks, of the most prominent founding fathers, why has John Adams been shafted? He predicted he would be underappreciated. Will he ever get a memorial in D.C.? That's a random question, but thanks, Sean.
He is underappreciated, primarily because he wasn't an especially good president, was a one-term president, voted out of office, and that makes it hard to elevate you into the pantheon of great presidents like Lincoln and Washington and Franklin Roosevelt.
Sorry, Jeff Cruson, I missed your super chat. Thank you for the super chat. I really appreciate that. They say, you say in your book that for the social unrest key to be turned, it has to be widespread and not isolated. Would January 6th, despite being major, have counted as an isolated or widespread if it had happened before the election? That's an interesting question.
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question. But as you know, I don't answer hypotheticals.
Oh, you answer hypotheticals.
But probably not if it just stayed isolated to that one instance.
Wow, we just got a $50 donation.
Nice. From who?
From the icon next door. Wow, there's an icon next door.
Oh, wow. We got to check that out. I had no idea such a thing was next door. We really need these donations because we operate on a shoestring.
You say that every week.
I know, and I mean it.
Okay.
And we also need people to, what do you call it?
Subscribe.
Subscribe. That's
yes.
it.
We are close to 2,000.
We want to hit 2,000.
If you're watching and you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Anyways, this $50 donation.
That's
from
awesome.
The icon next door.
All right. What's his question or her question?
Usually you say their question.
Oh, okay.
Because then you don't have to worry
his
about
or her or whatever the pronoun may be.
Do you think the Dems should have worked to negotiate somebody more moderate like Arnold Schwarzenegger for speaker? I think putting AS in Arnold Schwarzenegger could actually bring some MAGA people back to normalcy because he has that TV alpha thing they love, minus the fascism. That's an interesting question for $50.
I love, I'm kind of a fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger, being a bit of a bodybuilder myself, right?
Let's see your guns. Flex right now. No, okay, look. That's pretty good
Not
for
bad
an old
for
man.
Old man,
I can see it there, yeah.
But that's not going to happen. That's just fantasy. The idea that the Democrats could dictate a speaker. I thought, a while ago, I think I mentioned that might be a possibility. But given the way Republicans have united behind the extremist Mike Johnson, I realized that was always a pipe dream.
I mean, I feel like during this whole thing, a lot of people were throwing out crazy names, but the chances of somebody like Arnold Schwarzenegger actually getting elected are basically zero.
Basically
right?
zero.
I mean, it's not a bad thought experiment. But
No,
I think
it's not. But
the reality of that happening is essentially zero. Yeah.
About the same chances of actually repealing the Second Amendment.
Hey, Bring it full circle. That's it. That's what good comedy routines do. You know.
Oh,
that?
good.
Bring it full circle.
Yeah. Should I hit the circuit?
Tell them your
circuit.
best joke right now.
No, I'm not going to tell.
Come on, go ahead. Tell them your best joke.
All right.
Let's hear it.
You ready?
Yeah.
So, the guy invests in a chicken farm.
Okay.
And then goes bankrupt. You know why?
Why?
Because the rooster was gay.
That was terrible. That's the joke you chose to tell in front of hundreds of people. That was terrible. That was so bad. All right, I got one. Okay,
I got a better one.
Okay, go ahead.
How do you know that a joke comes from your mother or father?
How?
Because the punchline is apparent.
Okay, that's a little better.
Little better.
At least
huh?
that's like a little clever and
Little
not
clever,
like politically incorrect.
Right.
I got
I don't mind being politically incorrect. Go against the grain a little.
I don't mind being politically incorrect either, but you still have to be funny. The rooster joke was not even funny.
All right.
All right, I got one. Why did the scarecrow win an award?
Because he was outstanding in the field.
That's correct, because he was outstanding in his field.
Yes.
Okay. People are probably like, what the heck
Yeah, really.
you guys doing?
I think we just flunked stand-up comedy.
Mark Klein asks, I have a question about the long-term economy key. Do you base economic growth on GDP or some other measurement?
Per capita GDP, although per capita doesn't mean much anymore because the population doesn't change that much. But like in the late 19th and early 20th century, it mattered. So real GDP. And real means you're adjusting for inflation.
According to Noam Chomsky, you can't have inequality in a functioning democracy. Chomsky also said that the fathers created inequality in the Declaration to limit U.S. democracy. Is this true?
Oh, boy. I agree partly with that. I do think inequality is a great enemy of democracy, and I do think we need policies, particularly tax policies and labor policies, to combat inequality. And I do think there is something to be said for that in terms of the framers of our government. But, here's the great paradox of American government. The framers, on the one hand, they were slaveholders, they were men, and they were all men back then, of commerce and business. They were the elite, and they did establish a strong government to protect the elite. But on the other hand, they were students of the Enlightenment, and they did establish a government that gave tremendous latitude, virtually unknown at the time, for the sovereignty of the people and the protection of critical rights like speech, free press, right to a trial by one's peers that were also unheard of at the time.
Thank you for that question. Let's see here. The Anonymous Bear says, Richard Pryor, you two are not.
I agree with that.
Agree with that
Don't ask me for any more jokes.
Okay. So John Jones with the super chat. We've answered this, John. They said, do you anticipate nationwide social unrest over Israel-Palestine? He said, not here, maybe in other countries.
Exactly. It's got to be here.
Let's see. Will Trump rank lower than Johnson Buchanan?
Fairly likely, or at least down on the bottom with those presidents. Hard to be worse than Andrew Johnson, but Trump is going to be ranked by experts as certainly, if not the worst, one of the worst presidents we've ever had.
Here's an interesting question from Elemental Bot. Does the amount of keys flipped in favor of a candidate indicate their margin of victory?
Roughly, but not exactly. In other words, the keys are not designed to measure margin of victory, but there is a collateral correlation between the number of keys flipped and the margin of victory.
Jim Blowers is telling jokes in the chat. He says, regarding chickens, don't count your chickens before they cross the road and come home to roost. More chicken rooster jokes.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's any better than mine.
Maybe he's talking about polls.
Maybe.
your poll philosophy.
Well, that's a good
Don't count your
point.
chickens before.
Yeah.
Don't listen to polls until they come home to roost.
That's brilliant. Who did that?
Jim Blowers.
Nice work, Jim.
Nice work, Jim. Here's one from Finn. On the topic of speaker, historically, who do you think was the most consequential speaker of the House in modern U.S. history?
Probably Sam Rayburn, who, the Democratic speaker for so many decades, who was extremely influential in adopting a critical legislation. If you want to go back to the Republicans, Uncle Joe Cannon in the early 20th century. And I've got to give kudos to Nancy Pelosi, the first and only female speaker who's incredibly effective and who showed you can unite around a speaker and you don't need to have the kind of chaos we've seen over the last 3 weeks. All right, we're getting close to the end here.
You're choking up, huh?
I know. I can only go so far, being old and decrepit.
How many keys do you think President Biden has activated, or at least in the vicinity of activating? We've talked about this.
We've talked about that. Most keys are still up in the air. Some keys are already like midterm elections he's lost. He wins, obviously, the incumbency key, and he would win the internal party fight key. He would lose the charisma key. So there are some we know, but so many keys are still up in the air.
Jamie asked about John Tester. We've talked about that, Jamie. We think he's got a good, or not we, but he thinks he's got a good chance.
He's got a shot, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think they're going to pass first, Israel aid or Ukraine aid?
Well, there's obviously much more Republican support for Israel aid. One of the great paradoxes of American politics is extreme right-wingers who are very much tainted by anti-Semitism historically have been fervent supporters of Israel. Why? The simple reason is that they believe control of the Jews over Israel is essential for Armageddon, the final battle between good and evil and the coming of Christ. But if Jews don't convert to Christianity, they're going to be consigned to the flames of hell. So this isn't a very positive vision for Jews, even though in the short run, it helps explain far-right support for Israel, which you wouldn't otherwise expect.
You don't think there's any other reason for that? I mean, also, I think it's just a geopolitical thing for the United States in general to support Israel.
Oh,
right?
yeah, but I'm talking about why the far right supports Israel. Obviously, the broad support beyond the far right for Israel has to do with the fact that it was the United States that really was the critical nation in immediately recognizing the state of Israel and recognizing that the Jews who have been persecuted and murdered and slaughtered for centuries upon centuries needed a sanctuary. Franklin Roosevelt, near his deathbed, just shortly before his death, after this arduous trip to the Crimea for the Yalta Conference, didn't go home. He went to Suez to meet with the king of Saudi Arabia to persuade him to establish Israel as a sanctuary for Jews, and promised all this aid that would make, the Arab lands, bloom. And he was flatly turned down. Ibn Saud said to Franklin Roosevelt, no, the Jews are our mortal enemy and we want to kill them.
Eris, I don't think we've answered a question from this user. Eris asked, do you anticipate the LGBTQ people are going to start facing more oppression and efforts from Republicans to take away or limit their freedoms?
Yeah, we've already seen that, particularly in the States. Let's look at Ron DeSantis and other governors and Republican legislators have, passed laws against gender-affirming care, and DeSantis has sponsored this so-called Don't Say Gay bill, where not just in early years of education, but right through 12th grade, I believe, or at least high school, you can't even talk about gender or sexual orientation. And by the way, this Mike Johnson has sponsored a similar piece of legislation nationally. You know, it just astounds me. Republicans don't seem to care about our planet burning up. They don't seem to care about, mass shootings. But by golly, we're going to stop gay pride. We're going to, make sure that we can't talk about sexual orientation in schools, as if those were the priorities facing the country and the world. It's just astonishing.
Why do you think Truman was willing to run as Eisenhower's VP after being president himself?
I'm not sure what that's...
Did Eisenhower say he would run as Truman's VP?
Oh, Eisenhower running as Truman's VP when?
It says, why do you think Truman was willing to run...
willing to run
as Eisenhower's VP after being president himself.
I don't think Truman was willing to run as Eisenhower's VP. There was some loose talk about that, but it was never real. We know who Eisenhower picked as his VP.
Of course.
Who?
I have no idea.
Oh, yes, you do.
Who Eisenhower picked
as his VP. Richard Nixon.
I didn't know that.
And why? Because Eisenhower was considered a moderate Republican, and he wanted a young, fervent, anti-communist crusader like Dick Nixon on his ticket, not Harry Truman.
Ross Goldberg asked, do you agree with a lot of progressives saying that Democrats in recent decades have become more feckless than they were during the Great Society era in the 1960s?
Absolutely. I've talked about this a lot, and it has primarily to do with messaging. Democratic messaging has been a disaster, certainly in recent years. Biden, as I've pointed out, has achieved the greatest collection of domestic accomplishments since Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, but nobody knows about it. They think he's done nothing. And Democrats used to have these great slogans, the Great Society, the New Deal, the bridge to the 21st century. This simple, compelling message is gone. Build back better. What does that mean? It sounds like something your kid does with Lego. So yes, Democrats really need to step up their game.
Pamela Mayer gave us $10. Thank
Nice.
you, Pamela. We appreciate that. All right, you want to take one more question?
One more question. We've been going for about an hour.
You're not wrong about that.
Yeah, better than my jokes.
I think we really failed with those jokes.
I think we did. We should stick to our wheelhouse.
What's your wheelhouse? What's my? I don't know what my wheelhouse. My wheelhouse is media. So
yeah, you should have had better jokes than that.
Yeah.
All right, last question.
All right, I'm gonna give everybody a couple seconds to start throwing in questions. Think about your best question. Oh, Alex Shim said we failed miserably on the jokes.
We know that. We admit to that. We admit to our failings. We take personal responsibility. We don't blame others.
Here's an interesting question. What do you think some future swing states could be?
The biggest future swing state that people have talked about is Texas. And they've been talking about it for a long time, saying, once Hispanics start registering and voting in substantial numbers, Texas, not going to turn blue, but could be a swing state. That would be an enormous shift in our politics because it's the biggest red state at the moment. But that has not come to pass. But keep your eye on that for the future.
But you didn't answer the question.
I did. Texas.
Oh, but you said it might. Everybody says it, but it might not happen.
It might not happen.
All right, pick something other than Texas.
Well, most states are pretty much cemented one way or the other. Maybe one of the western, more democratic states, like Nevada, which has been democratic, but, narrowly so, and is not guaranteed to be a blue state.
Here's an interesting quick question. What's your favorite area of history outside of your specialty?
I studied, I haven't studied it much recently, but I studied medieval history as one of my fields in graduate school.
Boring.
Oh, medieval history is not boring at all.
Oh, okay. That's your answer?
That's my answer. And I'm sure it's not one anyone would have expected.
Who's going to have a better record? Michael De Souza Cruz wants to know, who's going to have a better record, the Patriots or the Giants by the end of the season?
I can never go against my Giants.
Basketball season started for any basketball fans out there. Knicks lost last night.
That was awful. That was a terrible performance by the Knicks.
I'm a Wizards fan who might be the worst team in the league. Any other basketball fans out there, put your favorite team in the chat. If you're still watching, throw a like. There's 120 people still watching, and we only have 46 likes. So throw a like. We're trying to push for that 2,000 subscriber mark. We're at 1,800 right now. We are trying to push for that 2,000 mark. Help us get to that mark. We've got Celtics fans in the chats.
Right.
We've got Nuggets fans in the chat.
Right.
We've got Golden State Warriors fans in the chat.
And I'm going to make a promise.
Okay.
If we hit 2,000,
yes,
I'm not going to tell another joke.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is really amazing. That will motivate.
That should motivate.
You hear that,
people.
guys? No more bad jokes from Allan Lichtman if we get to 2,000.
And what about bad jokes from you?
My joke was fine.
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right. Put in the chat right now whose joke was better. His rooster
No,
joke?
I don't want. No,
I want to hear it.
No, I don't want to hear that.
His rooster joke or my scarecrow joke? Either write scarecrow or write rooster.
How about my parent joke? That was pretty good.
All right. You can write parent/rooster or you can write scarecrow. Let's see what people say. All right. Saying goodbye to... Aris said my joke was better. Scarecrow. Roaster joke was bad. Scarecrow was good. I'm crushing you.
Yeah, I'm being crushed.
I'm crushing you. All right.
Right.
Thank you all for tuning in. Shout out to Michael De Souza Cruz, Syed Ali from the UK, Eris, the Alex Treefire, Jamie Smith, Antonio Romero, who's a Miami Heat fan, Shades Guy, Bienvendita Garnett, Ryan on Wheels, we got a Giants fan, I Heart New York 2001,
wow, all right.
Giants fan, Alex Shim, Ross Goldberg, Paul Folo, Will Strumacher, the Smoking Cat. Till next time.
Subscribe.
Subscribe. Have a good night. Go Knicks.